This is Join Us in France, episode 44. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
And we welcome you to the Join Us in France travel podcast. Elise is a professional tour guide, art historian, and a really good storyteller. On today's show, we visit the lovely city of Bordeaux on the Atlantic coast. So all the way west. What do you mean?
No, my dear.
Oh, it's not on the Atlantic coast?
Oh, no, it's not on the Atlantic.
Well, it's not right on the Atlantic.
Oh, no, it's 100 kilometers from the ocean.
Right. But I meant it's like towards the Atlantic and south.
It's towards the Atlantic. It's on the estuary called the Gironde.
That's right. I knew that. Okay, it's famous for winemaking, of course. It's famous for a lot of things, and Elise will tell us all about it.
Right.
So, you'll find our show notes for this episode and all of our other episodes on joinusinfrance.com, which is also where you'll find the episode map, where you can see all the other places that we've talked to. So if you're planning a trip to France, you can see if we've already covered that or not. All right, now a little music to get us in the mood, and we'll come back and talk about Bordeaux. All right, Elise. So what do you have prepared for us on Bordeaux?
Well, let's start with now, and then maybe this time we can work our way back, because Bordeaux has actually a very, very, very interesting and very sometimes movemented and controversial history.
Okay, yes.
But it
controversial.
Is controversial, yeah.
I like that.
But, of course, when most people hear Bordeaux, they think of the wine.
Of course.
Obviously.
Yeah.
And the reason why is because Bordeaux has been through the centuries, and really for a very, very long time, really for centuries and centuries, the place that wine not only was the center of the region where a lot of wine was grown, but it's because it became famous for being the place that wine was shipped out from.
Right.
Because, in fact, Bordeaux is a port city.
Right.
And
but not on the Atlantic.
But not on the Atlantic, Annie. No. In fact, it's taken me a long time, but of course it's because I went there twice in the last couple of years. And really the second time, the last time I was there, we went from visiting the city for a couple of days to the Atlantic, and it's a really good way of getting a feel for how far away from the Atlantic it actually is.
So would the Atlantic be Pauillac?
The Atlantic, Pauillac is actually on the Gironde. So let's explain a little bit. Bordeaux is on a body of water that is where the Garonne River, the main big river in the southwest of France, which is, of course, the river that Toulouse is on.
Right.
The Garonne travels northwest.
Yeah.
And joins up with another river called the Dordogne River.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit smaller than in size and in length, I guess, than the Garonne. And at the point where they join together, they open into an estuary.
Right.
And the estuary is called the Gironde.
And it's a big, massive thing.
And it's huge. And it's not a tropical estuary like, if you can imagine, the Mississippi, the mouth of the Mississippi, or the Amazon, or things like that. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't have many tiny little branches. But I did fly over it just a few months ago. Mm-hmm. And it was the most wonderful thing to see, because you see the curlicues of the Dordogne and the beautiful open curves of the Garonne, and it empties into this what, of course, at first, if you are coming from the river point of view, looks like another river, but if you're coming from the Atlantic, which I was, it's the mouth. It really is the mouth, and it opens up. It's 12 kilometers wide at the
big thing.
Widest part, where it empties into the Atlantic, and that is actually, if you go from, and Bordeaux is situated pretty much where the Dordogne, the Garonne, and the Gironde all meet up.
Okay.
So you have to go about another 50 kilometers straight up that coast, which is really north by northwest. not to mention the movie by Hitchcock, but that's something else. And if you follow, which we did, which was really lovely, you can actually do that. There's a road that follows along the waterline pretty much. You get to the point on the southern side of the Gironde as it opens up, and you can see across this enormous mouth that opens up into the Atlantic Ocean to the town, which is on the other side. And that is Royan. Royan is the town on the other side.
Yeah.
So Bordeaux, of course, is, from the point of view of people like us who are inland and landlocked, Bordeaux does always seem like it's on the Atlantic. But in fact, it's actually it's about an hour from the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And if you go straight due west of Bordeaux, you go driving through the major area called the Médoc, which is, of course, one of the most important of the wine growing areas around Bordeaux. And you wind up where you have the dunes, the famous dunes.
Oh, yeah.
So it's very beautiful. And there's beach and coast that's absolutely gorgeous.
Yes.
All along the whole Atlantic coast there, going all the way down until you get to Biarritz.
Yes.
And it's very,
I'm
very
told
famous.
there's some good surfing going on that way.
Yes, there is. People who are surfers have a particular affection for a certain part of the coastline as you get further south, but it's also very treacherous, and it's a part of, a lot of people go vacationing along the coast west of Bordeaux, the Atlantic coast. There are those who prefer the ocean and those who prefer the Mediterranean because it's much more tranquil, and it doesn't have this huge currents and it doesn't have huge waves. But one of the things about all of the coast with its beaches, if you do the southern Atlantic coastline in France, is that it's an area that has very, very treacherous undercurrents. And so it's one of those, it's one of the few places where if you ever do that, you need to go where there are lifeguards, which is not true along the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean has areas that have lifeguards, but it's not considered to be dangerous if you don't go. But that's what vacationers who are Bordelais and the people from that region, that's what they do. They tend to go to that part. So so Bordeaux itself, Bordeaux is a port, and Bordeaux is a city that has that in 2007, part of it, the historical part, the part that is along the water, was made a World UNESCO Heritage Site, which, of course, adds to this incredible rivalry that is this historical rivalry between Toulouse and Bordeaux, because they have a rivalry that has to do with their sports teams, their rugby and their soccer teams, and a rivalry about their past and which city has a more noble past. It's kind of silly, but that's the way it is. And of course, the other thing that makes it very interesting to talk about the rivalry between Toulouse and Bordeaux is that Toulouse is a brick city. The traditional building material, of course, is all this beautiful, really beautiful red-orange terracotta, this brick. And Bordeaux is famous for being a city made out of white limestone. And it is one of the most spectacular parts of Bordeaux. And what they did when it was putting in its application to become a World Heritage Site, they did what had been done about 20 years ago in Paris, and there was a huge amount of money spent to clean up the buildings in Bordeaux that are along the banks of the Garonne and the Gironde, because Bordeaux, interestingly enough, is a city that is long and narrow. So a lot of the city developed first along the waterway, first along the part that's the Garonne, and then out towards the Gironde, where the commercial port part is actually in the Gironde part, whereas the actual residential part that's old Bordeaux is still along what is called the Garonne. It's hard to know when one pretty much ends and the other one begins. But what happens is if you are facing the old part of the city from the other side of the river, the north side of the river, what you see is a very, very long expanse. And I really don't know how many kilometers it is, but it's really quite long.
It's long,
of gleaming white, beautiful limestone buildings. And if you go back inside to parts of the older part of town. There still are parts where the buildings, of course, have not been cleaned up, and so they're really kind of gray and grungy looking because cleaning up limestone is, of course, an extremely expensive thing to do.
Yeah.
But it really gives a certain look, a certain cachet
Yeah,
to,
a lot of
to
Bordeaux is gray. I mean, not all of it, obviously.
Not all of it. But of course, people who really like stone really think Bordeaux is beautiful because everything, and there's a style of house that's called the Bordelais house, which is very low. It's interesting because it's a house that is one story up at most, and it's because the city is relatively densely built along the waterway, because this is where all the money was and this is where people built their houses, and so the houses tend to be connected, but these are houses that are not very wide, but very deep. And so when you go inside, and this apparently was inspired by the Romans, and this is part of the ancient history of Bordeaux. So when you go into a typical Bordelais house, you have a doorway, and then you have a little central hallway, and then you have an open courtyard and garden, and the houses have the rooms and the apartments built around that. So it's very charming, but you don't see a lot of that from the outside. So it's kind of fun if you ever get to visit a city like Bordeaux, if you can find somebody who will invite you into their house, just so that you see what the typical layout is, because it's very specific and it's really known as the Bordelais style of house. Yeah. So the area that's... it's called the Port of the Moon, Port de la Lune.
Yes.
Which is the part that is the UNESCO World Heritage Site. And it's because the history of Bordeaux is so connected to its port activity.
Sure.
And a little anecdote. Now, this may be a little bit because, of course, more loyal to Toulouse, even though Bordeaux is a very interesting place to visit. In 2010... 3 years after they received their label as a World UNESCO Heritage Site, there was a move made in the city to do some work to modernize this famous bridge called the Pont de Pierre.
Yes.
Which is one of the reasons why it was given the label. And the committee of UNESCO World Heritage Sites was incensed that they were going to try and modernize the bridge. And there was a big deal because it was in the French newspapers, and they said that they would take the label away.
Oh, wow.
If they modernized this bridge, which has something like 11 arches underneath, and it goes across the Garonne River. And it was like a big to-do, because how dare they, after working so hard to get this label, how dare they try to do something to change what made it historically interesting. So I kind of thought that was funny. I thought, so of course they can't,
Right.
Once you get a World UNESCO Heritage label, you have to keep the things that were there when you got it. Otherwise, they take it away from you. It doesn't make any difference. Nobody cares. So where is Bordeaux? Bordeaux is actually 500 kilometers from Paris.
Yeah.
Not as the crow flies, but almost, because you go basically north by northeast to go to Paris. And there's a huge autoroute and a very good bullet train that goes from
TGV,
Bordeaux to Paris. So you can actually get there in 2.5 hours.
It's very fast.
Very fast.
Yep.
And it's 220 kilometers, which is about 160 miles from Toulouse.
Yes.
And that makes it just about 2 hours of driving, on the big autoroute.
Yes.
It's 200.
If you don't hit too much traffic.
If you don't hit too much traffic. Yeah, we've done it a few times, and pretty much once you get to the area on the outlying area, which is a very developed suburban area, you wind up, I'd say 2.5 hours to get into the center of Bordeaux. It's also just about 200 kilometers from Spain.
Yeah.
So if you go down the coast, you go to Biarritz and Basque Country, and then you get to Spain. So for a lot of people, it's a very interesting area.
Oh, yeah.
And it has a major airport, not an international airport, but also one that connects to a lot of places. And so it's not only a beautiful place to visit, but it's a good place to start if you're going to explore the Basque Country and the coast of the southwest of France. So it's kind of interesting. So Bordeaux is a city that rivals Toulouse for whether it's the fourth or fifth biggest city in France. Do we care? I'm not sure if I care.
No, but because we are the fourth.
We are the fourth. There you are, ladies and gentlemen
dispute.
out there.
There's
there
nothing
you are.
to talk about.
There's nothing equivocal in that comment that Annie just made. She knows that Toulouse is the fourth. We might have a couple of boxing matches over this question, but the last statistics were really that it was almost neck and neck between Bordeaux and Toulouse. Who knows? I really, really don't know.
Yeah.
But in both cases, the city itself has a certain population. And then when they include the outer areas and the suburban areas, that's when we count the main population, the greater Bordeaux, greater Toulouse area.
Yep.
But basically what we're saying is that in terms of the country, it's a fairly big city.
Oh, yeah.
But it's a fairly big city like Toulouse that is not a vertical city, which is, of course, true, I guess we could say, of most of the cities in France, except perhaps for Marseille, which is interesting. But it's low buildings. There are no high buildings, and it's spread out. It's very spread out.
Yep.
If you go to the center of Bordeaux and you want to spend a couple of days there, my advice to people is to not have a car unless you're going to stay in a motel or hotel on the outside of the city and then go in, because ever since they put the tramway system in, which was in 2003, the tramway in Bordeaux is wonderful. There are 3 big lines, and one of them, which I took just a few months ago, takes you along the Garonne and along the Gironde. And if you just want to ride it, just so that you get an idea of how
pretty.
big and long the city is, it's kind of fun because you just go to one end and get back on and go back the other way.
Yeah.
But what has happened is, because the old city center is filled, like in a lot of old cities in France, with narrow streets, by digging up a lot of the streets to put in the tram line, they turned everything into one way. And so it's hell to try and drive through the city center.
Yeah, it's not a very easy,
And it has a very good tramway and bus system. It doesn't have a metro system. So my suggestion is, if you want to rent a car, save it for when you're going to go out of the city and do an excursion outside of the city.
Yeah.
Unless you choose to simply stay in a place that's on the outside edge, and then you just get on the tramway and the bus to go visiting the city itself. Don't try and take a car and go into the city center.
Yeah, it's hard to park too.
It's hard to park.
It's expensive.
It's hard to drive. It's very, very expensive.
Yeah.
So Bordeaux. Bordeaux is a great place to walk around. It's a city that has a lot of little squares. It has 2 big main streets that are pedestrian streets that crisscross. One is very, very long, called Rue Sainte-Catherine. And the other is Rue de la Porte de Dijon. And one crosses the other. And the big main street, Rue Sainte-Catherine, really runs north-south, and it takes you pretty much from where you can find the tourist office, which is a very good tourist office filled with lots of information. And it's also the place where you can go if you want to do any excursions outside of the city, a day or a half-day excursion into wine country. That is where you would go to pick up one of the excursions, and they have many of them. And they will take you to all of the different regions that grow wines, which really are in all the 4 cardinal directions outside of Bordeaux.
Yeah, we did one of those with some friends a few years back. So the meeting points are either the train station or the Office du Tourisme.
Right.
We went to the Office du Tourisme. We wanted a tour in English. I think it was a full day, but I can't remember. We were assigned this tour guide who was memorable because he was really trying too hard. His English wasn't that good, and he made really silly mistakes that if he had been listening to how his customers were talking, he shouldn't have. He was just somebody who lives in his own bubble kind of thing, not very open to the exterior, and he kind of sounded like Pepe Le Pew. It was kind of... But there's dozens of tour guides in Bordeaux, so you have no guarantee of meeting Pepe Le Pew.
Right. And,
great entertainment for us.
Bordeaux, which is part of why the history of Bordeaux is so interesting, but because of the relationship through the centuries of Bordeaux to England, there are a lot more people in Bordeaux that speak English than in the inland part, like around where we are in Toulouse.
Yes.
Here we have, of course, a large English-speaking population of people who come to live and work here.
Yeah.
But Bordeaux has been traditionally a city much more aligned with England in its loyalties and in its aspect of living.
Yeah.
And so there are actually a lot of people in Bordeaux who are French, but who do speak English. So it's kind of surprising, actually, to have someone whose English is not that good. But I mean, that does happen.
Happens.
You know,
It happens.
that happens. Bordeaux has some wonderful. It's a great, as I mentioned, it's a great walking city. It's not a circular inner old city like Toulouse or even Paris is, if you imagine something on a scale that's, you know, much bigger.
Yeah.
It's long. It runs along the Garonne, and it pretty much goes north-south. But just to mention a few of the places, because one of the things about Bordeaux, unlike Toulouse and unlike a lot of other cities that are ancient cities outside of Paris, it's a city that has almost nothing that is older than the 18th century. It was rebuilt, more or less, starting in the early 1700s. And so there are 2 or 3 places where there are some vestiges of things that are really ancient. But that's all, because what happened was that through the centuries, there were enormous numbers of invasions and wars, and really starting way back, 2,000 years ago. And interestingly enough, Bordeaux, of course, was a major point of exchange and a major point of contention during the 100 Years' War, which really lasted 300 years between the English and the French. And what happened was each time
100-year wasn't long enough.
No, it wasn't long enough. They did it. They really did it from basically from the 1200s until the end of till just about 1500.
Wow.
The English and the French fought over Bordeaux and the region. And so every time what happened was they destroyed stuff and they rebuilt, which means that when all of that finally calmed down, and they got into what became their largely prosperous time period. It got rebuilt starting at the beginning of the very, very beginning of the 1700s in classical style architecture. Which is why you have all of these very beautiful uniform buildings that are all with this gorgeous stone, and lots of buildings, especially the important buildings with columns and the capitals that are decorated on them.
Yeah, when I go to Bordeaux, I think this is a city that takes itself very seriously.
That's right. It's true. It's very, very true.
Yeah, so much more than Paris. Actually, Paris doesn't give me that impression because Paris, Paris has like a sense of humor to it.
Yeah.
Well, Bordeaux, to me, like culturally, it feels like they're just not.
Well,
they need to relax a little bit.
The Bordelais believe because they have. Interestingly enough, Toulouse has as long a history. And even in its ancient history, it's as important as Bordeaux was. But the Bordelais, which of course is the name of the people who live in Bordeaux, believe that they have a superior heritage. And so, and I'll talk about that in a minute because this is where we get into the contentiousness about their history. But it also comes from the fact that maybe because they don't have anything left of their medieval architecture, which Toulouse, of course, is famous for. They have this classical architecture, which is very similar to parts of the Latin Quarter in Paris, which is very gorgeous, of course, with the stone and the columns and the triangular pediments and the rooftop and all of that. But there's a kind of stuffiness, perhaps we can say, to this kind of architecture. And it goes with the fact that it was really sponsored from that time on by Louis XIV and Louis XV. And so the people in Bordeaux were really connected to Versailles and to the kings. And so I think they, now, of course, this is us from Toulouse putting words in their mouths. But I think they think of themselves as having a noble heritage. Whereas Toulouse has a much more mixed bag heritage. And I think it's much more laid back because of that.
Yeah.
I'd say so. And that, of course, has to do with the attitude that people from Toulouse have about Bordeaux. People think that people from Bordeaux are snobbish. I don't know if that's true.
I don't really know either. I mean, I have a few relatives who live in Bordeaux, but they're not from there originally.
Okay.
So, they're very nice, but it's hard to know.
It's hard to know. One of the things... walking around Bordeaux, I think Bordeaux is a place that you can really easily spend 2 days and not be bored. You can see lots of different things. Part of it is because there's so much beautiful walking to do. And I'm just going to mention a couple of the squares that I particularly like because they're not very big. One of them is close to, it's on the southern side near the Garonne. It's called Porte de la Monnaie.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, it's called Porte de la Monnaie because, in fact,
the money door.
In the money door, exactly. In the 1700s, this was the building where they used to make the money. This is actually where and it's become a neighborhood that's very beautiful and it's, well, I kind of favor Bobo neighborhoods. You know, I like bohemian, bourgeois neighborhoods. I have to admit, I really like things like that. The streets are gorgeous. The houses are beautiful. Mm-hmm. It's filled with little fun little places to have coffee or a glass of wine or eat. And it has a certain young atmosphere. And it's right near the music conservatory.
Uh-huh.
And so it's a lovely, lovely part of the city to walk through. And it gives you an idea of what the city was probably like in the 1700s and the 1800s as well. And that's kind of on the southern end of the old part of the city. You have to sort of zig and zag your way to get there. But you get to see a lot of other things. There's a very beautiful church called the Church of Saint-Michel. You're not far from the Garonne, so it's the kind of place where you can actually take one of the tramway lines, the one that runs all the way up and down the Garonne, and just get off at one of the stops right at the Quai de la Monnaie and walk around there, and then you can just get back on. You can do one of these all-day unlimited tickets.
Sure.
And it's really fun to do. If you want to do the walking street, the pedestrian street, the very long one, that's great too because they have a museum, which I am sorry to say Toulouse does not have. It's called the Musée d'Aquitaine, which means that it's a museum about the region, not just Bordeaux, because this is, of course, the capital of the region called Aquitaine,
yes,
which was very, very important for many centuries. And what I love about this museum is that unlike a museum that specializes in only one time period, Middle Ages, modern, whatever,
sure.
Because of the things that have been found in the region, not just in the city of Bordeaux, the museum starts with prehistory. And there are lots of sites nearby because all of this is limestone. So they have lots of sites where they found beautiful objects and some decorations from 15, 20, 25,000 years ago.
Wow.
And so what the museum does, it's beautifully, and it's in this beautiful mansion from the 1700s. So it goes up through time from the prehistory to the early Roman times, to the early Middle Ages, to later Middle Ages, Renaissance, and up through into modern times. So you really get a panoramic view of the art and architecture that really starts at the very, very beginning, not even 2,000 years ago, but zillions of thousands of years ago.
25,000, actually.
Yeah, really. And it's gorgeous. The museum is really beautiful. And it's a great, great visit to do.
And that one is which one again?
It's the Musée d'Aquitaine.
Musée d'Aquitaine. Okay.
And it's really nice. And the museum itself is right off one of the two big pedestrian streets. And nearby, you get to see some of the other things. You get to see a tower called the Tower of the English, which is from the Middle Ages, is from the War of Religion. And of course, why was it called the Tour des Anglais? Because during the period of time from the 1200s to the 1500s, when it was really controlled by the English, it wasn't the English who spoke English, it was the people who were loyal to the English crown, right?
Okay.
So this was one of the towers that was built when they built the second or third set of ramparts because of all of this fighting between the French and the English. Now, one of the things that...
The rampart's still there?
No.
Okay.
There are two teeny places where there are sections of wall, but little teeny places. I mean, you really have to go search for them.
Okay.
This is not one of those cities that has a lot of the ancient wall left. It was all torn down when they redid it in the 1700s, basically.
Mostly large French cities have not kept their ramparts for obvious reasons. You can't expand if you have a rampart.
No, you can't. And interestingly enough, because the city has such an old ancient history, the ramparts really were started, first set of ramparts in about 300 AD, which is when the invaders all began, because Bordeaux, its original name was Bordigala.
Bordeaux quoi?
Bordigala.
Bordigala.
Burdigala.
Okay.
And there are lots of things called Bordigala in Bordeaux.
Of course.
And Bordigala was the name that was given to it when it was one of the most important sites in the Aquitaine region of the Roman Empire. And even back then, the Romans did not make it into a city as such. It was a commercial port. And because it was so important, because it opened onto the Atlantic, and because from there they were trading with, now this is going back, of course, really 2,000 years. They were trading with the British Isles. They were trading with Northern Europe. They were trading, and they were going down the coast of what is, of course, Spain and Portugal.
Yep.
The Romans considered it to be one of the most important of their comptoirs, one of their commercial centers. And they named it Bordigala. And the original peoples who lived there, like in most of the southwest of France, were in fact a Celtic tribe who quickly Latinized and became part of the affluent trade. Believe it or not, I was looking this up because I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to make a mistake. The Romans discovered that the Celtic tribe that were there were already trading with the British Isles. And guess what they were trading?
Wine.
Tin pewter.
Huh?
They made, it's a huge mineral area. Sorry for the stuttering.
Yeah.
And they were the masters of making tin and pewter. And they traded with other areas that had other products because theirs was the most sophisticated center for all of this mineral work, which is very, very interesting. And I don't know if it had to do with the minerals in the land or whether the water, but they apparently had grown one grape there.
Okay.
One of the things about Bordeaux is that it has what is called an oceanic climate.
Of course.
What does that mean? Well, of course, it means that it never gets really cold in the winter.
Right.
It gets kind of wet and cool, but it doesn't get super cold.
Yeah.
And it has lots of rain.
You're right. Right.
But it also has lots of sun.
Okay.
So apparently, there are certain grapevines that get moldy right away if they are grown in an area like this. So when the Romans came, and of course the Romans always brought their grapevines with them because they had to have their wine every single day.
Clever people that they were.
Clever. They apparently did some botanical mixing with the local variety of grape that was grown. And I don't even know if it was a grape that was grown for eating or...
Right.
Because I don't think the Celts had beer. I don't think they ever actually made wine. But they apparently did some botanical mixing and matching and created a couple of varieties of grapes that were resistant to the humidity of the ocean air.
Yes.
And that is why, since the land around there is filled with limestone and sand, it's not a very rich area that you can grow lots of other crops.
Right.
Very quickly, the Romans realized that it would be really good for growing grapes. So really and truly, the whole thing about it being a traditional wine growing area is legit.
Yeah.
And it goes back as far as the Roman Empire.
Yeah. Well, there's no doubt. I mean, it's the big...
it's the big
agricultural
thing. Right.
I mean, that's what you grow.
I mean, remember the Champagne area, they started with old grapes and then they really took off in like the 800s, 900s.
Yeah.
Well, here it was actually much earlier that they started growing. However, what's interesting is that we go to a story that a lot of people know about, at least they know a little bit about, and that is the wonderful story of Eleanor of Aquitaine.
Yes, I've heard of her.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, Eleanor of Aquitaine was the daughter of the Duke of Aquitaine.
Uh-huh.
Now, Aquitaine was the name given to the region first by the Romans, and then when the area was after the Roman Empire fell. Okay, you have all the invasions like everywhere else,
Yes.
So the Vandals and the Huns and the Goths and the Visigoths came, and like in Toulouse for about 100 years. Because the Romans wanted to get rid of them because they were sacking Rome, So they said, go, take southwestern Gaul. You can have it, do what you want. Who cares, just leave us alone. And what they did was they made Toulouse their headquarters. And this is, of course, in the end of the 500s, in the 6th century AD. And they went to Bordeaux. And they made it their second capital. So they had one inland and then one on the water leading out to Atlantic because they wanted to really continue, because the Visigoths were actually a kind of nomadic people that were pretty good warriors, but they liked to settle for a while in a particular place.
Okay.
And so they made Bordeaux their first capital, and that was pretty much when the area got Christianized.
Okay.
Which takes us to, what we talked about in Santa Milione and all of that,
Yes.
their hermitage and the monasteries and all of that.
Yes.
Except that the Visigoths were a different kind of Christian than a lot of the other areas. And so what happened was the Franks, who were already in the north of what we now know as France, they were really ambitious in terms of taking a kind of an imperial attitude towards conquering more lands. And they came and they pushed the Visigoths out and across into what is, of course, now Spain. And the Visigoths basically went across the Pyrenees and stayed. And so, that's another story. But what happened was that the Franks took over both Toulouse and Bordeaux.
Okay.
And they, under Charlemagne, good old Charlemagne, in the end of the 700s, they created a nice administration, and they named it Bordeaux. How the name came about from Bourg de Gala, I really don't know.
Yeah.
It got transformed into Bordeaux.
Yeah.
And because Charlemagne, his son, and then his three grandsons really created an empire, and with with real administration and control, to have somebody in each region that would answer to them, they created dukedoms.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So we have the dukedom of Aquitaine.
Yeah.
And Eleanor, 200 and something years later, is the only legal and legitimate child of the Duke of Aquitaine.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah,
And
because it's surprising to have a woman with such power
Exactly.
back then.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, for reasons that I would be interesting to know more about, because I really don't, the kingdom or dukedom, if you want, of Aquitaine was known for being the most cultivated, the most erudite, the most intellectual. They had music, they had art, they had all kinds of things going on in Aquitaine. And of course, Bordeaux was one of the two centers, the other center being Angers, around Angers and Poitiers, which is much further north, but it was still all part of this huge area of Aquitaine. And she was considered to be the most cultivated woman of her time.
Sure.
She spoke several languages. She knew everything about politics, about music, about art. And because she was the only legitimate child, in order to make a political marriage, she was married off first to the King of France, Louis VII.
Okay.
And with him, she had two daughters.
Okay.
And then, for reasons that are kind of hard to understand, but apparently had to do both with ideological reasons and her personal ambition to be a powerful woman, which is why she's considered to be such a heroine these days of modern women. And because of probably a disaccord about other things, I don't really know, but she actually asked for divorce. Now, you don't get divorced.
Right.
You don't get divorced,
When you're
first of
Catholic,
all,
you
if you're
don't.
Catholic, and you don't get divorced in the end of the 1100s if you are the Queen of France. You know,
Yeah.
you don't just go, hey, I just would like a divorce. We don't forget the alimony. I'm richer than you are. It doesn't make any difference. So what they did was, because at some point, and I don't really know the details, there are lots of books about her life that are really fascinating to read, but I don't remember some of this anymore. But they went and petitioned the Pope, because he actually agreed finally to do this. And because in those days, unfortunately, still today, excuse me for saying unfortunately, but it's still true, in a lot of cases, you can't get a divorce. You have to get an annulment if you are practicing Catholic.
Right.
Even though they had two daughters who were the daughters of the King of France, the Pope actually gave them an annulment.
Right. The rich and famous have usually been able to arrange such
Right.
things.
And she basically never really saw her daughters again.
Oh.
She went back to Aquitaine, and very shortly after, she married again.
Okay.
And who did she marry? She married the King of England, Henry II.
Okay. Okay.
And by marrying Henry II, now this was both, interestingly enough, according to the things that I have read. Now, I don't really know if this is true, but I guess it's me being a little bit romantic. She married him for two reasons. She married him because it was an alliance that she wanted to make, because she really wanted to be against Spain and France. She wanted to have a powerful alliance of the independent kingdom of Aquitaine and not become a part of France. But she also married because she was in love with Henry II.
I see.
And he was about 6 or 7 years younger than her.
The plot thickens.
The plot thickens.
A queen that actually likes the guy.
She actually liked the guy. And you have to understand that she had already had 2 daughters. She was no longer a young girl. She was about 29, if I remember correctly, when she married Henry II. And she proceeded to have 6 children with him.
Oh, wow. Wow.
You know, and she lived to be a very old lady. But the story of her life is another whole story. But what does this have to do with Bordeaux? It has everything to do with Bordeaux, because from the day she married Henry II, Bordeaux became the center of export of wine to England.
I see. So with her first husband, did she live in Bordeaux?
She did not live in Bordeaux, and she
Okay.
didn't live in Aquitaine. She had to live in Paris, and she hated Paris, and she hated speaking French. She wanted to speak Occitan, which was her first language, and she knew how to speak English, interestingly enough. And it's
Or
because...
at least the English of the times.
Oh,
this is
English of the time,
Late
which-
1100s, you said?
This is the end of 1100s and the beginning of the 1200s. So this is...
that's not English like we
No,
are
it's
doing
not.
now.
And it's a language that, of course, is mixed with some French and all of that, and Latin and everything else. But, of course, she spoke perfect Latin. She could read and write in Latin.
Yeah.
And so what happened
Probably
was
Greek, too.
that Henry II laid claim, of course, and she knew this was going to be the case, to the entire region of Aquitaine, which included going into the Pyrenees. Gascony was considered to be part of Aquitaine. And, of course, this made England bigger than France, more powerful and richer than France. And this was really her intention. She was really hoping to stick it to France. And what happened was that Henry II, and then, of course, eventually his sons, came to claim this region. And it was the beginning of this period of almost 300 years of fighting, which is considered to be the 100 Years' War, but really lasted
Went
from
on
that
longer.
time until peace was made at the beginning of the 1500s.
That's really interesting that she wasn't actually living in Aquitaine.
No.
So the title, I mean, the name just comes from the title.
The name comes with the title. She was actually, yes, when she was younger, she was living she didn't live in Bordeaux. She lived in the north of Aquitaine. She lived for a long time in Angers, which is
Okay.
now a small city. She also spent time in Poitiers. This was the northern extreme of the Aquitaine
region.
region. But these were the cities where she grew up.
I see.
And Bordeaux was the place she went to. Now, her daughters eventually... And her daughters eventually married into the royalty in Spain. If I'm not mistaken, it was her daughter or granddaughter that was Blanche of Castile. So you know, she seminated basically between her daughters and her sons. She managed to spread her blood into the
So she had
kingdoms.
8 children
She
total.
eventually had 8 full children that lived to adulthood,
Wow.
which is amazing for the time.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And she lived to be about 78 or 79 years old.
Yeah, that's old too.
She
for
was
that
really
time.
a nice old lady by the time she died. So what happens is Bordeaux suddenly becomes extremely important. It's
Because of this
strategically
wine
because
trade.
of the wine, and because Henry II adds ramparts to the city to defend it against the French. So we have the beginning of this incredibly prosperous time for Bordeaux, but also a time of war between the French and the English, which, if you remember when I was saying that along the rivers there were the castles that were built by the English and the castles that were built by the French, right?
That was the area of
When we were talking
Saint-Cyr-la-Popie.
of
So the
Saint-Cyr-la-Popie,
Quercy.
right? The Quercy. Well, the
Yeah.
Quercy, of course, becomes the extreme eastern limit of the fighting between the English and the French over this huge mass of what is now, of course, France.
Yeah.
And of course, it took until almost 300 years later for them to finally sign a peace treaty. But during all of this time, the Southwest, and particularly the area around Bordeaux, is under the control of the English, and wine becomes one of the most important exports. And so you have the
Still is
still is
for that region.
and still is. And then what happens is by the time the treaties are signed in the beginning of the 1500s, so we're talking the beginning of the 16th century, this is really almost 300 years later, for a short time, the French kings who have now won back this area, and this is now part of the Kingdom of France, they forbid the production and exportation of wines of the Bordeaux area.
What?
Well, they don't want the English making money off of French wines.
Oh.
And what they do is, because there's a whole story that goes to the story about the wines in Cahors and the wines in Gaillac and all of these areas much closer to us, because those were originally the wines that the French kings would drink and that they were selling to Spain and to the northern countries. And what had happened was that under the English, they had the English who controlled Bordeaux and the port taxed all of these other wines so much that they couldn't be sold.
Wasn't worth it.
It wasn't worth it. And that is when the English came to love what they still to this day called claret, which is Bordeaux.
Oh.
That's what the English call Bordeaux wines, claret.
Claret.
Now people are much more sophisticated, and so you'll talk about your different regions by region, but that is the traditional name for the wines of the Bordeaux region. That is claret. And what happened was, in vengeance, in revenge for the decimating of the wine-growing economy of the central south part of France by the English, for a certain amount of time, they forbade the selling of Bordeaux wines. So you have this rivalry that has to do with the wines on top of everything else.
Yeah.
And this is basically when Bordeaux gets transformed, and all of medieval Bordeaux winds up basically disappearing. And then we come to the part of the history of Bordeaux that is really still, to this day, somewhat contentious, starting in the early 1600s. In the 1500s, which is the 16th century, you have the War of Religion.
Yes.
We've gone from the war between the English and the French to the terrible period of time of the war between the Protestants and the Catholics,
right?
Which really is a civil war all over France.
Yes.
La Rochelle and other towns up the Atlantic coast are the bastion of Protestantism. Bordeaux is a bastion of Catholicism.
Yes.
And they have this terrible massacre there, and they basically kill all of the Protestants. And what happens is that there's a period of terrible upheaval, which is a really long, complicated history in the sense that France really goes through a lot, and particularly the southern half of France, which is the area that for some reason was the area that adhered a lot more to Protestantism than in the north.
Yeah.
And then eventually things are calmed down. And Bordeaux, which has been taken over by basically conservative Catholic nobles and has been designated by Louis XIII as a region that is a royal city. The port of Bordeaux starts to become one of the ports for slave trade.
Yeah.
And it's one of the headquarters of what is called the triangular trade. And interestingly enough, it is not the most important city in the slave trade. Nantes is, which is, of course, much further north. Even La Rochelle, which was at first during the War of Religion, the bastion of Protestantism, which is a very beautiful small city with a port also, was also a slave trade port. But the one that becomes the most famous and the one that's talked about the most to this day is Bordeaux. And what happens is that you have, of course, these ships that leave from the port of the Gironde in Bordeaux, that travel down to the coast of Africa, that pick up the people who are going to be who are captured and going to be sold as slaves, and they go across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, to the islands, where these people are basically left and, of course, used as slaves. And there, these ships pick up the products that are the things grown on the islands, which is coffee, sugar, and eventually then cocoa. And those ships go back to Europe and sell all of these commodities. And so you have this, what is called the triangle of the trade of the slaves. And I think perhaps, and maybe we'll get a listener from Bordeaux who's going to be very upset about my saying this, but I think that maybe one of the reasons why this stays in the collective memory far more in Bordeaux than it does in Nantes is that there seems to have never been a period of apology in the Bordeaux experience about having lived through this. It just seems to have been something that is, yes, we did sell wine. Yes, we did participate in the slave trade. This is the golden, richest period of Bordeaux, the 1600s and the early 1700s. And there's a vestige of something left of this that people seem to still have a hard time with.
Yeah. But to put it into perspective, not that I want to defend that at all, but we both have a friend who's done some research on this. And,
right.
And she was pointing out that of like Portugal, Spain, England, France is the country that traded the smallest number
That's right.
of slaves.
Right.
Not that it makes it okay.
Not that it makes it okay.
But at least we have that. And France also outlawed that sort of business much quicker than the other countries.
Except for England, actually.
Oh, England?
Yeah, England did
first?
Yeah. Well, actually, France did first. And this is interesting because, of course, part of the other history in the more recent past of Bordeaux, which is very interesting to know, is that, of course, during the French Revolution, slavery was abolished. And yet Napoleon, who came into power in just about, 1801 or 1802, he reestablished slavery in the colonies, which, of course, was re-abolished in 1810 or 18, and then there was a lot of contentiousness about it because he had reestablished it for a very short time. But what happened was that Bordeaux was conquered by Napoleon. And it was one of the sites of one of the biggest battles between the Spanish and the French during the Napoleonic Wars.
It's also complicated.
It's very complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Bordeaux, unlike Toulouse, has lived through a lot more great upheaval, social upheaval and historical upheaval, even in the last 200 years. And it's interesting because when you see it today, it's this gorgeous, relatively wealthy, tranquil city that relies on its past as a beautiful place from basically the 1700s and 1800s. And then to add to all of this, during World War II, Bordeaux was occupied from the get-go by the Germans because it's close to the Atlantic seaboard.
Yeah.
And so, unlike Toulouse, which spent 2 years being a free zone city and only was occupied from November of 42 to November of 44 and had a huge, huge history of resistance, Bordeaux did not. And not only did it not have a history of resistance, it is also a city that had a history of having members of the French administration who were as compliant as you can be with the Germans and with the Vichy government. So there is a lot of this.
Yeah.
It's very strange because obviously this is not to say don't go to Bordeaux.
No, this is old history.
But I think it's really interesting to know that France is not a very big country, certainly compared to the States. And yet from town to town and region to region, we're talking about a distance of 160, 170 miles from between Toulouse and Bordeaux.
Yeah.
The histories are different.
Yes.
And it really makes for a different atmosphere and a different feeling when you go there.
Yes.
And it's also interesting to know because it's part of their past.
Yeah, of course.
So, I have to admit that I really enjoyed my 4 days of visiting Bordeaux and the region because it was interesting to see what it looks like. And it was interesting to find out these things because it doesn't feel the same as here, or it doesn't feel the same as Marseille.
Yeah.
And stuff like that.
Toulouse is more happy-go-lucky kind of town.
And it's
feeling.
And it doesn't. Yeah, it's a happy-go-lucky kind of town, and it doesn't need to defend itself in terms of its history and its reputation. And that's a very interesting thing. So, but Bordeaux is a fascinating place. And just to mention, if you want to go out from there, if you go to the northwest, if you rent a car, you can also get, of course, do an excursion that you can get at the train, as you mentioned, the train station or the tourist office, or rent a car and do the Médoc area. It's gorgeous. It's not very...
Saint-Emilion, actually.
Saint-Emilion. We've talked about Saint-Emilion. Saint-Emilion is to the east and to the south. But if you want to get an idea of the expanse of how much wine-growing country there is, the largest area that has one designation is really the Médoc.
Yeah.
And it takes you all the way out to the Atlantic coast. And it's kind of neat because you can get to see some of the crazy fantasy chateaus that were built starting in the 1800s by these people who made enormous amounts of money.
Yeah, and they're beautiful.
But they're beautiful. You know, you have the town of Pauillac, which is on the Gironde.
Yeah.
You can also drive along the Gironde and stop and have fish in one of these little restaurants that has an outdoor deck, you know, nothing fancy. Watch all of the big boats that come in and out of the Gironde that go out to the ocean and come back in. It's really impressive. And the waters are saumâtres there, you know, because
that means they're
kind of
mixed seawater and regular water.
Regular water.
Whatever that's called.
And there's this famous wave that happens, I don't remember exactly where the tide from the ocean comes up the Gironde and meets the waters moving out from the Garonne and the Dordogne. And so there's this incredible wave that people actually go surfing on. It's kind of neat, but it's this phenomenon that happens there because of that. It's a place that has a lot of sun in spite of the fact that it gets a fair amount of rain. It's also very sunny a lot. And since it doesn't have extremes of temperature, it's a place that's visitable, I'd say, pretty much all year long.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously in the winter, you know, you might not want to spend too much time.
It'd be grayer, but...
It's grayer. I mean, and it can, of course, rain. I mean, we got stuck one day with the rain. But it's really a great place.
Anyway.
There are a couple of other museum-type things that are really great to visit. And also, it has this huge square called the Quinconces.
Le quoi?
Quinconces.
Okay.
It's the biggest. It's supposed to be the biggest square.
Un quin ou un quai?
Quin. Quinconces is what they call it. And it's this huge open esplanade square. This is where they have their markets and their fairs. And it has this huge fountain, this gorgeous fountain from the early 1800s right in the middle of it. And it's supposed to be the biggest open square in all of France.
Oh, wow.
And right next to it, there is a monument to the history of the whole area. And very close by is a beautiful park, a botanical park, with a great garden. It's really beautiful. And nearby there, just a couple of blocks away, is a museum of contemporary art that is really good, really interesting. And the building is gorgeous. It used to be, okay, Annie, what's the word in English for the chai?
Shy.
The depots where they used to keep the wine. Chai.
Ah, Chez.
Chez.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
Oh, well, these were built in the 1800s.
Yeah.
With the affluence of Bordeaux.
So they have, like, very big wine barrels.
Well, in other words, the building itself is very big.
Yeah.
It's 2 stories high or 3 stories high with huge open space on the inside. And it was built, the Chez were built on part of the ruins of the medieval walls. So part of the walls are these gorgeous stone walls.
Yeah.
And it's this huge building. And I don't know exactly when, but maybe in the 80s. I don't know if it was in the 1980s or 90s. I should know, but I didn't look it up. It was turned into a museum of contemporary art. And it's wonderful.
I'm going to have to look that up to see how you say that in English. I'll put it on the show notes.
Yeah, and it's really great because it has a little cafe. It's very close to a bunch of other things. It's close to the beautiful gardens and park with the botanical gardens. It's close to the river. It's close to this huge open esplanade. It's near the spot where you get on the pedestrian walk or near a tramway. And unlike a lot of other museums of contemporary art, this is contemporary art. This is not even, like real old, like it's not impressionist and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's a fun place to visit.
That's cool.
It's really cool. So, and it's got some really nice things. So I'd say that there's really a lot to do
At
in a
least a
visit.
couple of days.
A couple of days.
Yeah.
And definitely, if you want to do an excursion to wine country, you can go to Saint-Emilion. You can go up into the Médoc area. You can take an excursion even across. They have buses that go across to the area called the Blaye. The Blaye, which is a little bit lesser known, but it has some beautiful wines that are less expensive. And it has some
How do you
village...
spell that?
Blaye.
Okay.
And it also has a section along the river that has caves that are troglodyte houses that you can see from a distance. So it's really pretty to visit.
Yeah.
So it's a really nice area to go to.
Yeah. So I was looking up some shopping that you can do in the area, and I'll put on the website in the show notes a few places where apparently you have some very nice vintage shops.
Great.
I have the addresses and everything, so I'll put that up for you. But as far as wine is concerned, there are a few boutiques that are notable.
Good. Cavistes.
Yes. So one is called L'Intendant. It's apparently one of the most beautiful wine shops in France. I have not visited myself, so I cannot tell you, but I'll give you the address on the website. Another one called... Oh, and apparently at the Intendant, it's a 4-story building with a spiral staircase, and the higher you go, the pricier the wine gets.
I like that. I'll sit down on the ground floor, I think. Do you have an address for it?
I do. It's Deux Allées de Tourny.
Okay. While you're talking about it, I'm just going to look and see on this if I can find it on this map.
And obviously in Bordeaux, you can taste wine a few places. Some of these places... like when we went on our tour, the expensive wine place, well, to us that was expensive. The cheapest wine they had was 160, and then it goes to 240. And they weren't even trying to sell bottles because they said we're sold out, and we don't even know if they have any in the city. So, and besides, we weren't going to buy wine there, so and they probably know that most of the tourists who go are not there to really buy wine, but they would just want to taste it. And it tasted just fine, but was it 10 times better than wine I usually get? I'm not sure. But anyway, that's for the analogues to decide. But there are also some chateaus there that are much more approachable, where you'll find, 10 to 20 euro kind of bottles.
That's in the outskirts.
Yeah, that's
right.
I mean, there's so many wineries that you just have to pick your winery, and some of the most expensive, exclusive ones are not open to the public unless you come with a tour guide, and even then, I'm sure some of them don't even open for that. Anyway, another wine store you could visit is called Le No Limite. That's
No Limit.
Yeah, No Limite. Yeah, it's kind of a. Okay, and it has bottles at more reasonable prices, apparently, and some art exhibits as well, which is pretty typical in France. Some of the boutiques will have art on the walls and stuff. And there's also a cognac store, a store that just sells cognac. Because cognac is not very far from Bordeaux,
that far.
the city of cognac.
Right.
And so they have a boutique that sells just that, and I'll give you the link to that.
Which for some people, they should understand is a kind of brandy.
Yeah, and it's really
wonderful.
No, it's nasty.
It was wonderful.
We don't agree on that. I love wine, but I can't do the...
cognac is wonderful.
Yeah.
Stop.
I
think I have found where your the other one is, because there's a place called the Cour de l'Intendance, and then there are these alleys that go off of it. So it's actually very close to the tourist office in that area. It's in that region right around there.
Okay,
and just to mention that again, if you that's inside the city. Of course, you can always... One of the advantages of going to a caviste is that it's a store that sells wines, which means that they sell wines that are produced by different people. Right. Whereas if you go to the countryside, you have to go from one chateau or house to another. And each of one, of course, produces its own wine.
Yeah.
However, it is really something that even the 4 days that we did that, we stopped in a couple of the chateau, and this was strictly Médoc. It was the first time I really wanted to explore the Médoc, and we bumped into some of the same people doing the same thing, and it was kind of fun. At one point, we all wound up having a coffee together in this little cafe, in fact, in Pauillac, and I asked them, and they said that that's what people in Bordeaux do on a typical weekend. They just get in their car and they go driving and they go visit a few of these places because it's typical for them to open up the house and for people to come and get some tastings. And there, of course, since the houses that they usually put a sign outside telling you the hours and when they're available, you don't have to buy. But it's fun to see what these beautiful places look like and to get different tastings.
And they probably won't give you a tour with explaining how they produce the wine and all that. Some places might, but most places probably won't show you, how they make the sausage.
No, we did one. We did one. We found one that did that. And in fact, it was, we sort of showed up at the last minute, and I don't remember which one it was. I'd have to find out. I have to go home and ask my husband. I don't remember. But she said, they just began. I'll let you catch up to them, which is kind of nice because most of the time they just give you a tasting. But there they actually showed us where they store the wine, where they age it and everything like that. But boy, one thing though, people should know, in the Médoc area and the Saint-Emilion, it's red wine we're talking about.
Yeah.
It's not white. If you want white wines, you have to go to the area that's southwest of Bordeaux, and that is the area of the Grave.
Yes.
Just in case people were wondering. I went looking for a bottle of white wine, and they looked at me and they said,
You fool.
You fool. You are not in the right part of the country. I said, okay.
The other thing that I want to mention about Bordeaux, and this has a lot to do with Toulouse as well, is that, as you know, Airbus is a big industry in Europe. And when you make airplanes, the way Airbus does, parts of the aircraft are made all over Europe. Several cities in England, several cities in Germany, in France, in Spain, etc. And so all of these things have to be brought together.
Right.
And it's a huge infrastructure. And when you're building airplanes as big as the A380, which is the biggest plane
in the skies now.
Yeah. You need massive infrastructure, and moving these parts like the wings by road is a huge headache. I mean, if you've ever driven in France, you know that there's roundabouts everywhere. You can't go in a straight line. There's low bridges everywhere. I mean, it's just impossible. So what they do is a lot of these bigger parts actually come in from the Atlantic into Pauillac, where they have a system. It's called roll-on, roll-off, row-row.
Row-row?
Yeah.
From boat to flatbed?
Exactly. And it's made so that it's very smooth. The parts are actually handled very, very smoothly. There's no jerking it around or whatever. And so it goes from Pauillac to Langdon. So that's like about 100 kilometers.
That's right.
On the river, on the Garonne River.
That's right.
And then in Langdon, they have another one of these ports that is made especially to take these parts off and then put them on trucks. And then from there, it goes, there's a whole long procession.
Caravans.
Yeah, and they do it at night. And around the Toulouse metro area, there's actually a whole infrastructure of roads that are especially designed and
just for that.
Modified. Well, you can use them if you're a car, you can use them too. But they are modified to be able to accommodate these. The wing of the A380 is 44 yards, I think. And that's just the wing itself. With all the packing, it's much bigger than that. They bring huge sections of the fuselage. They bring the tail. Well, in part, the parts of the tail. Anyway, it's huge and it's fun to see. And so, if you're in Bordeaux and you happen to see something big going under the Pont de Pierre, and it says A380 parts inside or something. I can't remember what it says exact. Oh, A380 on board, it says.
On board.
They have two of these huge
Does it actually
barges.
go under the Pont de Pierre?
It does,
wow.
But they have to wait for low tide and specific conditions.
Okay.
But it's quite fun to see how these things happen,
And if I remember correctly, what I read yesterday was that they've actually designed a special boat for carrying these
special barge.
It's really a special barge.
Yeah, there's two of
them.
them.
They are enormous.
Yeah.
But that's the other thing. I mean, Bordeaux is still really a very important port.
Shipping port. Yeah.
Shipping port. Yeah. It really is.
Yeah, because Airbus brings stuff in with modified aircraft.
Right.
They had the Beluga for the long A330.
Right.
Anyway, it's a modified plane that will carry, but when it gets that big,
it has to be by ship. And one of the things that I found that I really enjoyed, and it's not something I would normally expect to enjoy, but the fact that we drove up along the Gironde as we were exploring after we had spent our couple of days in the city of Bordeaux, was that you see all of the maritime traffic that's going up and down the Gironde, and it's really quite impressive.
Yeah. There's a lot going on in the area. I think the history was fascinating. Usually history kind of bores me.
I know.
But this was interesting because I didn't know a lot of it.
Oh, and something else, talking about ships, which we didn't mention, and I probably should have, was that there are a lot of cruise ships that actually dock in the Gironde area.
Yeah.
There are two kinds. There are ships that do the river cruise that goes into the Dordogne-Garonne and does in fact a river cruise that goes through the wine country. But then there are cruises that actually start in Bordeaux and then go out onto the Atlantic. So it was pretty neat. It's also probably because having grown up near an ocean.
You like that?
I like that.
Yeah.
I don't have to be in it. I just have to see it. Somehow there's a sense of open space that I enjoy.
Being in that ocean, you'd get cold real fast.
You get cold real fast,
Whoa,
Yeah.
I like warm waters. Mediterranean kind of person.
She is indeed.
Yes. Give me the south of Spain any day. I can deal with that hot water. Anyway, okay, everybody, thank you so much for listening to us. We would love it if you would go to joinusinfrance.com/Amazon and click on your country flag. If you're going to be purchasing stuff from Amazon anyway, it won't cost you any more, and it helps us pay the cost of having this show on the air for you.
It's like giving us a Christmas present.
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, we just get a small commission.
Just very small.
And there's no obligation. I mean, you do it if you want to, but you don't have to. It's just that there are monthly costs that come with putting on a show like this, and it'd be nice if the show paid for itself, That's how I see it. Anyway, thank you very much, and we will talk to you next week.
See you again soon. Bye.
Au revoir.